What you're watching unfold right now in the Black Sea isn't just a military story, it's the story of who controls the world's food supply, who writes the rules of global trade, and whether the architecture of economic power that has defined the last 30 years is quietly being dismantled, one missile strike at a time. Because when Russia launched its sustained campaign of drone and missile attacks on Ukraine's port infrastructure in Odessa, on the ports of Pivdeny and Chornomorsk, hitting oil storage tanks, damaging a Panama-flagged civilian grain ship, and killing civilians going about their daily lives, was why in some severi, it wasn't doing something random. It was executing a strategy, a deliberate, methodical strategy to choke off Ukraine's economic lifeline and reshape the map of global commerce in ways that will affect every single person watching this, including you sitting right now in America. And most of the people covering this story are missing what's actually happening beneath the surface. So let's slow down and talk about the real picture. Roughly 90% of Ukraine's agricultural exports move by sea, and the 6 ports in the Odessa region processed around 76 million tons of cargo in just the first 11 months of 2025 alone. Read that number again, 76 million tons. That's not a minor trade corridor. That's one of the most critical arteries of global food commerce on the entire planet. And Russia has been methodically bombing it. Since the war began in February 2022, Ukraine has continued to rank among the world's top 5 exporters of wheat and corn, with that trade flowing largely through Odessa. So when you strike Odessa, you're not just striking Ukraine, you're striking the global grain supply, you're striking the countries in Africa and the Middle East and South Asia that depend on affordable food to feed their populations, you're striking the future of a food system that billions of people have come to rely upon without even knowing it. Now, the question you have to ask yourself, and this is the question that almost nobody in the mainstream media is asking seriously, is why is Russia doing this? And more importantly, why now? The official Kremlin line is that these are military targets. Russia's defense ministry has stated that its strikes are aimed at transport and port infrastructure used in the interests of Ukraine's armed forces. That's the official position. But Ukrainian officials and independent analysts see it very differently. Ukrainian officials and analysts dispute that claim, arguing the attacks are designed to choke export routes and destabilize the broader economy. And when you look at the pattern of what's being hit, it is extremely difficult to see this as anything other than a sustained economic warfare campaign. Oil storage tanks, grain terminal infrastructure, civilian cargo vessels, warehouses. These are not battlefield assets. These are the guts of a working commercial economy, and Russia is tearing them apart systematically. Here is the strategic logic that Moscow appears to be following, and you need to understand it because it matters enormously for what comes next. Russian President Vladimir Putin has previously said Moscow wants to restrict Ukraine's Black Sea access in retaliation for Kyiv's recent drone attacks on Russia's so-called shadow fleet of vessels, which carry a variety of commodities. So there's a tit-for-tat dynamic happening here, which is interesting on its own, but the retaliation claim, while partly true, is only the surface layer of this story. The deeper logic is this: Russia understands that Ukraine's ability to sustain its war effort, its ability to maintain domestic economic stability, its ability to hold together as a functioning state under pressure, depends heavily on export revenue. And the single most important channel for that export revenue flows through Odessa. So if you can strangle Odessa, you strangle Ukraine's economic survival, you create the conditions for political fragility, for social exhaustion, for the kind of desperation that might eventually push Kyiv toward terms that favor Moscow. And the timing here is not coincidental. The escalation in Russia's assault on Odessa has unfolded as Washington stepped up diplomatic efforts to bring an end to the war. Think about what that means. At the very moment that peace negotiations were supposedly gaining momentum, at the very moment that U.S. envoys were sitting in rooms with Russian representatives, that Ukrainian officials were meeting American delegations in Florida, Russia was simultaneously raining missiles down on one of Ukraine's most vital economic assets. The latest strike on Pivdeny targeted reservoirs following a previous missile attack that resulted in 8 deaths and at least 30 injuries. 8 people dead, 30 more wounded, not soldiers on a front line, civilians in and around port facilities, and this was happening while diplomats were shaking hands and exchanging talking points about peace, and so that tells you something very profound about how Moscow views negotiation. It views negotiation not as a path to resolution, but as another theater of war, a space to win concessions, to exhaust your opponent, to shape the terms of any eventual agreement from a position of maximum leverage. Trump's administration formulated peace plans that have been met with refusal from both Russia and Ukraine, and Russia has repeatedly refused calls for a ceasefire. Meanwhile, Trump's chief Russia-Ukraine negotiator, Steve Witkoff, has traveled to Moscow 8 times since March 2025, but has yet to visit Kyiv. You sit with that for a moment. 8 trips to Moscow, 0 trips to Kyiv, and during this entire period, Russia has been launching what the Wall Street Journal described as an intensifying campaign against Odessa's port infrastructure, energy systems, and civilian areas. Russia launched around 52,000 drones at Ukraine during overnight attacks in 2025, a sharp increase compared with previous years, with Odessa emerging as a primary target. 52,000 drones in a single year. That is not a military operation looking for an off-ramp. That is a military operation pressing for total advantage. Now, let's talk about the global dimension, because this is where it gets really important for Americans to understand what's actually at stake here. Because there's a narrative that circulates in certain corners of American political discourse that says this war is Europe's problem, that it's far away, that it doesn't touch ordinary American lives in any meaningful way. That narrative is not just wrong, it's dangerously wrong. Global grain and oilseed futures moved higher as renewed attacks on infrastructure in Ukraine and Russia heightened concerns over crop exports from the strategically important Black Sea region. Chicago wheat futures rose by as much as 0.8%, canola futures gained up to 2%, and palm oil prices also advanced on fears of tighter vegetable oil supplies. These are numbers that move commodity markets, and commodity markets move grocery prices, and grocery prices move the budgets of working families across the United States. The war in Ukraine, specifically the war being fought over Odessa's ports and trade routes, is not a distant abstraction. It is embedded in the price of the bread you buy, the pasta you cook, the vegetable oil that goes into the processed food sitting in your pantry right now. Since February 2022, Russia has made 50 attacks against Ukraine's Black Sea ports, damaging more than 300 port infrastructure facilities and 23 civilian vessels, and destroying more than 100,000 metric tons of agricultural products, according to Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha. 100,000 metric tons of grain destroyed, gone, not redirected, not rerouted. Destroyed. That is food that the world needed. Food that was bound for markets in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Food that, when it disappears, creates ripple effects through prices and supply chains that eventually show up in the inflation numbers that American economists and policymakers are trying to manage. And the campaign is accelerating, not slowing down. The attack directly targets Ukraine's economic survival, striking the primary maritime corridors used to export grain and other critical commodities. Damaging civilian vessels and storage infrastructure risks escalating insurance costs and deterring commercial shipping, effectively imposing a naval blockade through force. And that word, blockade, is the one that should arrest your attention. Because a blockade without declaring a blockade is one of the most powerful tools of coercive statecraft in the modern world. If you make the insurance costs high enough, if you make the risk calculations for commercial shipping companies steep enough, you don't need to physically stop ships with naval vessels. The economics will do it for you. The shipping companies will reroute. Cargo carriers will avoid the Black Sea. Insurance premiums will become prohibitive. And the result is functionally identical to a blockade. Ukraine gets cut off from global markets, without Russia having to formally declare one and face the full diplomatic consequences that would follow. Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan stated that Black Sea escalation is very dangerous and can impact not only Turkey and other littoral states, but also Europe. Turkey's position in all of this is fascinating and underappreciated. Turkey controls the Bosphorus Strait, the narrow passage that connects the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, and under the Montreux Convention, Turkey has significant authority over what military vessels can pass through that waterway during wartime. And Turkey has been trying to walk an extraordinarily delicate tightrope, maintain simple maintaining its relationship with Russia, honoring its NATO commitments, facilitating some aspects of the grain corridor, and managing the risk of becoming collateral damage in this intensifying maritime confrontation. After Russian origin attacks on Turkish-owned ships, Ankara issued a stark warning to both sides that targeting commercial ships would not be tolerated. When Turkey is issuing stark warnings in both directions, you know the situation has become genuinely dangerous in ways that go beyond the bilateral conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So, that is only stammen away And then there is the shadow fleet dimension, which deserves far more attention than it gets. Russia's shadow fleet, in a way, Rossiyski, a network of roughly 1,000 vessels used to transport Russian oil in violation of Western sanctions and the G7 oil price cap, Mussies, has come under sustained Ukrainian drone attack throughout 2025. Ukraine has been striking these vessels, some of them more than 1,200 miles from Ukrainian territory. Ukraine's SBU claimed that Ukrainian drones struck and critically damaged a Russian shadow fleet oil tanker in the Mediterranean Sea on December 19, 2025, more than 1,250 miles from Ukrainian territory. The ship was identified as the Omani-flagged Kendall. Think about that for a moment. A drone attack in the Mediterranean launched from Ukrainian-controlled territory or Ukrainian-operated assets, striking a vessel flying an Omani flag. We are in a new era of maritime warfare, one where the rules that governed naval conflict for the last century are being rewritten in real time, and where the implications for global trade, global energy markets, and global security architecture are enormous. The Shadow Fleet now comprises over 1,900 vessels globally, according to Windward's third quarter 2025 risk report. 1,900 ships. That is a significant chunk of the world's commercial tanker fleet operating outside the normal systems of regulatory oversight, insurance frameworks, and international maritime law. And those ships carry the oil revenue that finances Russia's war machine. So, as adby intintis, every barrel that moves through the Shadow Fleet is a barrel that keeps the Russian defense budget funded, keeps the missile production lines running, and keeps the drones flying over Odessa. So when Ukraine strikes those vessels, it is striking at Russia's economic engine, which is precisely why Russia responded by escalating its attacks on Odessa. This is a war of economic attrition being fought through maritime infrastructure, and both sides are now deeply invested in winning it. Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister Oleksiy Kuleba has stated that the purpose of these attacks is to reduce Ukraine's export potential and is about deliberately provoking a food crisis in those parts of the world that directly depend on the supply of Ukrainian grain. That is a Ukrainian government official saying explicitly on the record that Russia is deliberately engineering a food crisis, not as a side effect of military operations, not as unfortunate collateral damage, deliberately as a strategic objective. When a government official uses language that precise and that stark, the world should be paying very close attention. But the cable news cycle moves fast, the attention economy is unforgiving, and these statements get buried under the next breaking development within hours, which is exactly the problem. Because the deliberate engineering of food insecurity as an instrument of geopolitical coercion is one of the most serious violations of the emerging norms of international law, and the fact that it is happening openly with the perpetrator suffering no decisive consequences is itself a statement about the state of the global order. Here is what this all means for the bigger picture and why Americans specifically need to be paying attention. We are living through a period of profound structural change in the global system. The post-1991 unipolar moment, the era when American economic and military dominance was simply the organizing principle of the international order, is dissolving. Not overnight, not in a single dramatic collapse, but incrementally through a series of events and crises that each individually seem manageable, but which collectively represent a fundamental shift. Russia's campaign against Odessa is part of that shift. It is Russia testing how much economic coercion it can apply to Ukraine and by extension to the global food system before the international community generates a decisive and unified response. And the answer so far appears to be quite a lot. Russia has repeatedly refused calls for a ceasefire, and Putin has repeatedly spurned negotiations with Zelensky while maintaining what the Institute for the Study of War has characterized as maximalist objectives tantamount to full Ukrainian and Western surrender. That is the context in which these port attacks are happening, not as a desperate military measure of a state under pressure, but as the calculated moves of a government that believes it has correctly read the limits of Western resolve and is exploiting those limits systematically. And the danger, the real serious long-term danger, is not just what happens to Ukraine. It is what other actors around the world are learning from watching this unfold. They are watching to see whether economic warfare through critical infrastructure can be waged at this scale without producing consequences proportionate to the aggression. They are watching whether the international institutions and norms that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of coercion still have any practical force. And so far, the lesson they are receiving is deeply troubling. The Black Sea is burning, the grain terminals are in ruins, and the world's food supply is more vulnerable than most people want to admit. So was say indeed. This is the reality behind the headlines, and it matters to you wherever you are in America far more than the distance on a map might suggest.